Thank you very much. Before we begin, can everyone please, if you haven't silenced your cell phones, make sure your cell phones are silenced. And if you want to follow the NED on Twitter, you can follow us at @NedDemocracy or #NedEvents. Today we have, first of all, my name is Brian Joseph, and I'm a Vice President for Programs here at the National Endowment for Democracy. We have three wonderful speakers with us today. To my left is Nury Turkel, an attorney in Washington, D.C., and the chairman of the board for the Uyghur Human Rights Project, which works on Uyghur human rights research and documentation. He has testified before the U.S. Congress and spoken and written widely about issues facing the Uyghur people. To his left is Sophie Richardson, the China director at Human Rights Watch. Dr. Richardson is the author of China, Cambodia, and the 5 Principles of Peaceful Coexistence, and an in-depth examination of China's foreign policy since 1954. She has testified before the European Parliament, the U.S. Senate, and House of Representatives, and provided commentary to the BBC, CNN, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post. Mehmet Can Juma, to my far left, has been a journalist with Radio Free Asia's Uyghur service for the past 12 years and grew up in China's Uyghur region before coming to the United States in 2003. As a services deputy director, he oversees day-to-day operations and reports on events inside China's Uyghur region and beyond. Each of the speakers will speak for roughly 5 to 10 minutes. After that, we will have plenty of time for question and answers. And let me first start with Nury.
Thank you, Brian. Good morning. On behalf of Uyghur Americans, I'd like to thank you for your interest and joining us in today's discussion. In the meantime, I'd like to thank the RFA and NED for allowing me to be part of this important conversation that we're having today. The work of Radio Free Asia has been, frankly, heroic. Since the opening of the Uyghur service in 1998, it has been tenacious in getting out the story of what is happening in our homeland, East Turkestan. Despite travel restrictions, communications blackout, fear of reprisals, RFA reporters have kept the issues alive. And I'm particularly thankful to the leadership, the management, Alam and Mehmet Cuma, to make the RFA more important than ever. But these reporters at the RFA have paid a heavy price for doing their professional work, giving voice to millions of voiceless Uyghurs in China. Congress has stepped up to address the Chinese government's egregious retaliation against these brave reporters. In a letter dated July 26, Senator Mark Warner of Virginia and 5 other bipartisan senators urged a vigorous pushback against China's attempt to punish the RFA reporters for their work. Again, on September 6, 8 more members of Congress publicly called for pressure on the Chinese government to release the relatives of fellow American citizens. I would like to also take this opportunity to highlight NED's commitment to the Uyghur people's democratic aspirations. Over the past 14 years, NED has supported the work of Uyghur organizations in human rights advocacy and democratic leadership training. I'm personally grateful to Carl and his team for the continued support. I also wanted to recognize Luisa Griva in the audience today. Thank you, Luisa, for your guidance and the support over the years. Over the past months, my organization, the Uyghur Human Rights Project and Human Rights Watch, both released exhaustive reports on mass internment of Uyghurs. Thank you, Sophie, and your team, particularly Mayo Wang, for the outstanding work that you guys have been doing to bring the issues to the attention of the people in the civilized world. Using first-hand testimonies from direct witnesses and family members of those detained, reports offer a heartbreaking picture of the suffering inflicted on the entire population. UHRP report detailed this shocking extent of the camp system across the region, emphasized that no Uyghurs is safe from internment. We have testimony from agonized relatives about the disappearance of students, farmers, storekeepers, religious figures, artists, athletes, and local government workers. At least to this day, 58 professors are confirmed to have been taken away. At this point, I'd like to recognize Shohrat Ushur for doing a fantastic job going after stories on the abuses taking place in our homeland. Human Rights Watch has documented that pregnant women, elderly people with serious illness, and people with disabilities are being held in the camps and subject to psychological and mental torture. The report also highlights the separation of children from their detained and disappearing parents. Reading these two reports creates a nightmare sense of unreality. Can this be really happening in the 21st century? Tragically, I can testify that this is the reality that all Uyghurs have been living in the past 19 months, at least since April 2017. Excuse me. Uyghurs outside of China have been gripped with shock and terror as these details emerge from the villages, towns, and cities that they once knew in our homeland. We're also living with crippling anxiety, sense of guilt, because we have lost contact with our loved ones, and an acute feeling of helplessness, and our inability to help our family members and friends we left at home. Why this is happening? What is the purpose of this kind of extreme and horrific actions by the Chinese state? Chinese government claims that there's no such a thing as political indoctrination camps. But Chinese representatives at the same time have claimed that it is necessary to carry out, quote, education and cure ideological viruses in order to create harmonious society and protecting Chinese state security. What is behind this idea? First and foremost, it's about Xi Jinping's China dream. That has a strong racial component. This is the idea that the country's greatness lies in the greatness of the Chinese race, not just the country's military and economic strength. The current PRC idea of national greatness therefore requires rewriting of history, such as saying that East Turkestan and Tibet have been part of China since ancient times, but also requires remodeling, reforming our very ethnic identity. UHRP has written a series of reports over the past 14 years detailing forced assimilation policies in every area of life, from language to education, from religion to art, culture and literature to marriage and family life. We feel like we were surrounding an alarm that no one heard. Looking at them now, these reports like a giant neon arrow pointing to the grave dangers of China's race-based nationalism, which has become an ever more important prop for the legitimacy of the Communist Party. In addition, the elimination of Uyghurs' distinct identity is tied to China's current bid to extend its influence beyond borders. Xi Jinping's Belt and Road Initiative is a key pillar of his ambition to establish Beijing as a global power. East Turkestan is strategically placed in the middle of Belt and Road corridors, extending westward through the Uyghurs' homeland into Central Asia and Europe. Now, these repressions would be possible without state-led racial discrimination and criminalization of our faith. The Chinese government has portrayed our ethnic distinctiveness as a threat to ordinary Chinese, and our religion is mental disease. Sinification through mandatory Chinese language and cultural classes and compulsory denunciation of Uyghur culture and belief in Islam in the internment camps are justified as necessary measures in reducing the threat. What can the world do about this and stop this madness? The first step is to ask ourselves a big question. What will history say about us when we knew that this was happening on our watch? Was China able to carry out these plans without any significant response from the rest of the world? It is past time to take a stand. Concerned governments, including Muslim-majority states, should follow the United States' lead in making public statements of condemnation that would give hope to the Uyghurs around the world. Hope is a necessary source of strength in the face of oppression. Senator Marco Rubio, Congressman Chris Smith have taken the lead and urged sanctions against several Chinese officials under the provision of the Global Magnitsky Act. In total, 17 legislators supported the initiative, and they have our deep appreciation. But it was disappointing that senators from California did not sign on, given the large Uyghur American constituents in the state. The delegation from Virginia, which is also have a large number of Uyghur Americans, have stepped up, including Senator Warner, Representative Jerry Connolly, and Don Bayer. Certainly, it's time for action. First, silence is not a neutral act. Public condemnation of crimes of this scale is not a noble act. It is a necessary act. Second, democratic governments must bring themselves to impose sanctions on Chinese officials who are responsible for building a terror state in East Turkestan. Visa bans, freezing assets, and exclusion from international banking are the least should be done so that officials pay costs for their grave crimes against humanity. Third, we must follow up only time that China has been in the hot seat for its crime against the Uyghurs, which was at the UN in August. An American vice chair of this third panel, Gay McDougall, showed real leadership. And it has been shown in the Western media after that powerful statement being made by Ms. McDougall. And China has been grilled this week at the 39th Human Rights Council session in Geneva. Most importantly, China's UPR review is coming up on November 6th. The US delegation must not be on the sideline on November 6th in calling China to account. Fourth, concerned members of Congress should organize a fact-finding delegation to see the total surveillance state that China has created in East Turkestan. If, as the government has said, there's an ethnic harmony there, then the Chinese government should welcome such a visit by the US members of Congress. Members of Congress should repeatedly and publicly raise this issue. The American ambassador to China also should continue to pressing to visit East Turkestan to observe the condition there. Finally, everyone involved in China, from business to academia to tourism, should ask themselves, is this a time for business as usual? Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Mama John?
Yes, thank you very much, Brian, for the nice introduction. And before I start,
Your mic is not on.
Turn your mic on.
Where's the button? Is it on now? Hello? Is it on? Okay. Yeah. Before I start, I'd like to thank Ned for organizing this event and supporting Uyghurs' aspirations for democracy. And I also thank Nury Turkel and Sophie Richardson for their unwavering support and promotion Uyghur case and Uyghur situation on international stage. Thank you very much. And taking this opportunity, I'd like to thank our RFA management for supporting us, especially Min for initiating this project and supporting us, sending us to Turkey for fact-finding mission. Because of her support, we're here today talking about this, the videos and the camp inmates situation in Uyghur region. And taking this opportunity, I also thank the courageous Uyghur staff. Because of their hard work and sacrifice and endless sleepless nights, this camp issue gained this much momentum on international stage. Thank you very much. I think they deserve a big round of applause. Thank you. When we start receiving the news about the camps, Alam and I sat down and talked about how we should cover this event, because the numbers were staggering. And the enormity of the issue was astonishing and overwhelming. It is, to us, very important because at the same time, it is nearly impossible to uncover the whole truth behind the camp issue. But it is also very imperative for us to go about it because we have to tell the world what's really happening behind these closed doors in China. At the same time, China, like everybody talked about, detained at least 6 of our staff members' relatives. And people talked about China is retaliating, China is intimidating of our staff and trying to stop us from what we're doing. But we have to go, we have to do it because it's not about us. It's about millions of Uyghurs who are suffering at this moment in the camps or outside the camps. So we knew that if we fail this mission, if we fail this moment, we fail the whole Uyghur people's plight. We fail ourselves and we fail our mission. So as being one of the only Uyghur service, Uyghur language media in international world, especially in the Western world, it is emotional for us at the same time because of those family relations, family issues, but it is also very important for us to report this issue as objectively as possible, as balanced as possible, as realistic as possible. So we tried our best. Here we are today. Still, there's much to be done because people are telling us that you only reported only 15, maybe 5% of the whole reality behind what's happening in China at this moment. But this is the mission that we are on today, so we are still carrying on our mission. And as we talk about the video, because it's all about the video today only, let me talk about how we start the mission. This July, men initiate this program and sent Chris and I to Turkey to a fact-finding mission. At the beginning, we had at least 6 or 7 people who kind of agreed to talk to us. But when we arrived to Turkey, they changed their minds because they have a lot of reasons, and we cannot blame them. But only 3 of the Uyghurs who finally came up and wanted to talk to us. And when we met them, we can see the agony, the suffering, the tragedy, the trauma the camp left on them. It's very evident. Some of them would cry. Some of them just stop in the middle of the sentences. And for example, this young lady, the Uyghur lady, she told us that it took her at least a year even to think about the horrendous treatment that she received in the camps. And she also cried that, when she was pinned down to the wall and she was tied down the chair, the tiger chair, the notorious chair, for 6 hours without any food and drink in the hot sun, she stopped because for her the pain is there, it's evident, and she cannot continue at all. And at the end she said, "You cannot film me, you cannot record my voice, I can give you only written statement because we can understand." She would say that the retaliation, the reprisal that her family would face in China, that's for real, that's happening. So we agreed. And finally, we had this video. As we saw the video, these 3 people comprises of and represents of the 4 mainly targeted Uyghur group in China, the Uyghur elites. Uyghur scholars, intellectual group, Uyghur businessmen, Uyghur social figures, and religious figures. These 4 group of people, the elites, the brain of the Uyghur society. They can lead, they can form Uyghur social life, thinking, way of writing, way of acting in social settings. These are very important people. China targeted them because without the brain, a society cannot function. So they are writers, they are thinkers, as well as religious figures. For example, like Nury just mentioned, so far we confirmed 58 well-known, worldly renowned Uyghur scholars are in jail at this moment. And China is saying that we are giving them training. What kind of training can you offer them? They're just PhDs, worldly renowned scholars. How do you train them? This is ridiculous. This is laughable. At the same time, like also Nury also mentioned, that China is targeting Uyghur families, family units. This is a less talked about topic in the states like this, but families are a very important unit in the Uyghur society because China's destruction to Uyghur society didn't start 2 years ago or 10 years ago. China's malevolent agenda has been in place over the past, since the inception of communist China. It's there. Let me give you one example. Because China, for example, changed the spelling rules for Uyghur language 7 times. Changed Uyghur writing system for 3 times. What kind of government to do that? Because they're there to destroy whole culture. If they had the opportunity to this destruction right now, what's happening right now, they have done it 50 years ago. They waited, but they've been doing it subtly because let's talk about education. The destruction of families starts from the kids. They separated the kids from their families. For example, right now, every Uyghur kid as young as 3, they should be sent a state-controlled education facility. And when they went home, they were forced to spy on their parents. They cannot teach whatever they want to teach to their kids. So the family tradition, the values stops right there. If you destruct families, what's going to happen? Because it's a much talked about topic in America, the family, how important it is. It is the last bulwark against Chinese intrusion, destruction to Uyghur society. Right now, that is already being taken away because this is not being talked about a lot. We're talking about this concentration camps. This is a very evident issue, but other issue is being carried out very sophisticated way, very subtle way. So this is a thing that world should pay attention. The families are being destructed. Uyghur brains, like the elites, are taken away, and Uyghur youth born after 80s. This is only the things that we are reported. I'm not making it up. It sounds like a conspiracy, but this is happening at this moment. This big conspiracy, China's malevolent agenda is on the way. So 1 million people, half of them young people, more than half is young people because born after 80s. This is what we reported. And most of them also religious scholars, and some of them, they call it former prisoners, including my brothers, for example. They didn't have any crimes. And they say, terrorists, we're training religious extremists. Yesterday we talked about with Alim, if you have 1 million terrorists in one country, what's going to happen? There's only 30,000 terrorists in Syria, in Iraq. What happened to those countries? This is very, 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 laughable. Laughable. So as being a journalist, I can only talk about what we have covered, what we have reported. So this China is already laid the path to destruct and destroy and subjugate, totally melt the Uyghurs into this so-called big Zhonghua family. So this is the moment we should act. That's what I can say. That's my
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Sophie?
Yeah, I'll both try to be brief and not make this sound like an Oscars ceremony, but huge thanks to the NED for its years of work on Xinjiang and the Uyghur issue. And we are in awe of what RFA's Uyghur Service has done. Happy 20th anniversary. Not only have you done extraordinary reporting, many of you are paying a cost we can't even imagine. And, I hope there is a tiny bit of comfort in the fact that you're now seeing the world respond, which wouldn't have happened, I think, had people not been willing to take those tough decisions. I do also want to applaud some of the extraordinary coverage from members of the international media. Emily Rauhala and Megha Rajagopalan are here today. They have led the pack with extraordinary reporting on Xinjiang as well. I think it is a gesture of potentially transformative consequence that academics around the world who work on Xinjiang have now agreed, at least 100 of them, to state in all of their public talks their concerns about what's happening in Xinjiang. I think if the global China academic community had been speaking up about some of these kinds of issues for years, we might be in a little bit of a different place on some of those as well. We're also incredibly grateful to people in the diaspora who have confidence in us to share their stories with us here and other places around the world. That takes guts and it takes trust, and we hope to keep earning that from you. I want to talk very briefly, I completely agree with everything that Nury and Mehmetjan have just said, to talk a little bit about pathways to accountability so that, God willing, 10 years from now, we're not in either the same place or in a worse place. I think it's interesting to have this conversation in the same week when the fact-finding mission on what happened to the Rohingya last year has reported. I would commend everybody to read what its chairman, Marzuki Darusman, had to say at the UN earlier this week, because there are some parallels there. The difference, of course, is that China is an incredibly powerful actor. And it takes a lot to shock my colleagues at Human Rights Watch, but many of them, when they sat down and started reading the early drafts of our report and were contributing points about what we as an organization could argue for, were astonished at the scope and the scale of the abuses and the narrowness of the paths in international institutions available to people, which is largely a function of China's incredible power, particularly within the UN. Maybe a better way or a more evocative way of making that point is that we have for over a year now begged, and I don't beg anybody to do anything, but we have begged governments to come together to issue a joint statement in one critical slice of the Human Rights Council's agenda, and once again, that went unheeded. Now, granted, there have been references by a number of governments under other agenda items, but those are done by individual governments, not the international community speaking with one voice to say, this must stop now to Beijing. There is another opportunity to do that coming up in the third committee at the UN in New York. But if we can't even get a joint statement at the Human Rights Council, it's that much harder to get a special rapporteur, to get a commission of inquiry, to get a debate at the Security Council, all of the kinds of things that my colleagues would recommend in the face of a crisis of this scope and scale. And as a result, we really have to look at other possible levers, particularly with respect to coordinated international pressure on Beijing, which it particularly dislikes. At the top of our list is the formation of an international contact group on Xinjiang. There is no reason, none, that all of the governments, particularly the ones that did speak up about Xinjiang this week at the Human Rights Council, couldn't come together in and of themselves to form a group that could compile evidence, take testimony from people who are willing to share it, to demand access to the region, to collect lists of missing family members. We've seen these kinds of mechanisms come together to create the necessary pressure on a government to end certain kinds of abuses, and normally those take place within the UN, but the world that we live in now makes that a much more difficult proposition. Individual governments have lots of options available to them. Certainly many of the steps that we've seen the U.S. take, both at the level of Congress and the administration, or start thinking about taking, are effective. Visa bans, sanctions. I think one area that remains somewhat underexplored is, first of all, essentially putting in place the kinds of sanctions that would effectively prohibit anybody from selling much of anything to, among others, the Xinjiang Public Security Bureau or other state actors. We had originally thought about this in terms of trying to get certain kinds of technology prohibited, but it's such a slow process, and the technology evolves so quickly, and much of it is dual use, that didn't seem a very effective path to pursue. I think it's far more effective to say, you just can't sell anything to these guys while this nightmare is going on. Flip that around, I think it's time for much higher due diligence requirements for any foreign companies that have or are contemplating investment in Xinjiang, particularly as various Belt and Road initiatives come online. I think it's very clear we're seeing the degree of repression we are, partly with a view from Beijing towards protecting that space for investment. Well, let's make the cost of that kind of investment a little bit higher. At a minimum, there should be human rights impact assessments. There should be clear due diligence plans, as is already required under the UN's guiding principles on business and human rights, to ensure that business operations aren't contributing to human rights violations. That's, I think, very fertile territory for the advocacy community. And then very quickly, as a last point, but certainly not least, any government that has a diaspora community must do a better job of both of the following things. One, categorically stating that it will not send anybody who has a pending asylum claim back to Xinjiang. And second, ensuring that people feel safe. I am sure there are people in this room who had second thoughts about whether they should come here today, whether it was safe, whether there would be a consequence for that. That is unacceptable. We're sitting in downtown Washington. I spoke at the Lowy Institute in Sydney about a month ago, and partly because we were going to be talking about Xinjiang, there was a turnout of people from the Uyghur community there. And partway through, at least one person got up and left. We later learned, because that person had been uncomfortable about the event being filmed and didn't feel safe sitting there. Downtown Washington, downtown Sydney. If people can't come to events like this, governments are not doing enough to protect people. And in that sense, every single government that has a diaspora community also needs to be saying to Beijing, not only are your abuses in your country unacceptable, you are not going to commit them in ours. So lots to talk about, but hopefully that's helpful.
Thank you, Sophie. Obviously, there's a lot to discuss. If you have a question, please raise your hand and we'll bring you a mic. Please identify yourself as well. Let's go in the second, right here.
Hi, good morning. My name is Arshan, and thank you all for coming here and for the work you've done. I want to ask about the scale of this. If you can illustrate in terms of a percentage of the population, how many people have been affected by this, whether that's people who are being sent to schools very early on in their life or people who have been taken to these camps later in life.
This may be an analytically unsatisfying answer for you, but there are different estimates about how many people are actually currently being held, whether there are quotas. We looked at this from the perspective of surveillance technology and how many people were being identified to be detained. I think maybe a better way to answer the question is to say that in our work, it became very clear very quickly that the conditions, that repression in Xinjiang is so pervasive that conditions outside these camps aren't a whole lot better than they are inside. And that we now live in a time when the Chinese government is dictating what names people can give their children, where they can go to school, what sort of education they have. And in that sense, I think it's fair to say that there's nobody living in Xinjiang today, or at least among Turkic Muslim communities, who are able to live outside this or insulated from this kind of repression. So I know that's not a hard number for you, but that's, I think, a more accurate way of thinking about the larger problem. You guys may have different views.
Yeah, I agree with Sophie that it's very difficult to put out an actual number because we were dealing with an authoritarian regime, information blockout, and punishing journalists, and how are you going to get the actual number? We can only make a reasonable estimate, and Sophie is absolutely right. Let's also focus on the people who have not managed to get into those camps. Today we're talking about total surveillance, pervasive surveillance, intrusion of privacy, and also separation of families. They're taking kids to and giving them out to adoption. And also one thing has not been really covered lately is forcing Uyghur women to marry off to Han Chinese people. So it's taking place in many, many different ways. If I were someone living in East Turkestan today, I'll be living in fear of apprehension every day, even if I did not get to the make it to the camp. So actually, to me, that is more fearful, more psychologically damaging than being in those camps. So, and one other thing that I really like to highlight in here is that there's a reason for academics and Western media likening what is happening in our homeland to all the ugly chapters in history books. Jim Crow laws, Japanese internment, Nazi Germany, South African apartheid, everything. There's a reason for it.
Yes, I can add something to it. Because we cannot, like Nury and Sophie said, we cannot estimate how many people are in the jail totally, but some scholars are estimating it could be about 1 million to 1.5 million. And as well as other 2 to 3 million people outside the camps and being trained, China said. Open camps it's called, but they can go home after the education ended at the end of the day and goes there in the mornings. And as a whole, China says there's 12 million Uyghurs in Uyghur society. With inside or out, all 12 million people, we can say confidently that they're being affected at this moment. Emotionally or physically, they're being affected. Another thing that Nury also mentioned, the schools. Right now, some families, let me just give you one example, and this is the well-known example. The religious figure recently died, somebody would say he's been killed because even if he's died outside the camps or inside the camps with his own disease it could have been, is inflicted because of the conditions in the jail. Salih Hajim, for example, he died, and his wife died before, and he got 2 daughters. All of them are PhDs. They are in the camps at this moment, and one of his husbands are very well-known, beloved Uyghur poet. He's been taken away to the camps. They got 8 grandchildren. Where they are, we don't know. And recently, Shohrat, we published this news, School of Angels. They're sending these kind of kids, those kind of schools, with barbed wires, police, with armed police inside the gates. They cannot escape from the Angels School. Look at this name, School of Angels. These are the names they're giving to the schools, School of Angels. So they're there. Families are destructed beyond our imagination. And let me take example of our colleagues and their brothers, the brothers' wives. They're all in jails. Where they are, the kids, we don't know. And I lost contact with my mother. It's been 6 months. 2 of my brothers had been in jail for 2 years, and we don't know where they are. What happened to their kids? So it's affecting everybody, inside or outside, even in the United States, even in Canada, everywhere. So 12 million people are totally being affected by this horrendous, atrocious, I could say, policy.
Over here. Wait for the mic, sir.
Hello. Good morning. My name is Hidetoshi Hashimoto, originally from Japan. Now, China is one-party dictatorship. According to State Department Human Rights Annual Report, in China, people do not have a right to change the government. Now, University Maryland College Park campus, you see floods of Chinese students everywhere. For example, finance program, master program, I heard that 90% class is Chinese. Now, those Chinese young people return to China. I'm hoping they demand accountability, transparency, rule of law, not arbitrary rule. Therefore, these Chinese students, they enjoy freedom here, contribute to democratization in China. That's my personal hope. Could you comment on this?
It's certainly an aspiration that it's an unimpeachable hope. Whether that comes to pass, we don't know. I mean, we certainly my organization makes an effort to talk to people who are here from the from the mainland for whatever purpose or whatever length of time. And there's sort of an interesting trajectory. It's not a big enough sample size, or it's not a controlled experiment, I think, to reach conclusions. I used to give talks on campuses all the time, and about 10 years ago, invariably I would give a talk on campus, and there would be some students from the mainland sitting right in the front row. One would write down everything I said, and the other one would photograph me, and then at the end, immediately somebody would get up and say that I had offended 1.4 billion Chinese people, and that my facts were biased, and the usual line. And that doesn't happen so much anymore. And I don't quite know what to conclude from that. I don't necessarily think that means everybody's convinced. It's hard to tell what the trajectory is. There's lots of academic work being done on whether these communities remain quite isolated and fairly insular and don't interact much and experience or take advantage of the freedoms that are on offer to them. I think there's a lot of evidence to suggest that the opposite is true too. But then there's the next question about whether people actually go back to China and try to engage in public life in a way that would aspire to bring those values to bear. And I think it's like the French Revolution, it's too soon to tell.
All right, Chris?
So Chris Walker at NED. Sophie, you described the ways in which leading democratic powers have been slow to use their influence, say in the UN, as China exerts its influence there to prevent meaningful critiques and condemnation of what's going on in Xinjiang. And I think you suggested this, but I just wonder if you could expand a little bit on what the absence of meaningful condemnation, systematic critique means for how the authorities in Beijing think about this. Do they see it as acquiescence, as permission to continue? And if that's the case, do we actually become complicit in what's happening there?
I think a lack of criticism emboldens them. And I think a relative lack of discussion about clearly, painfully clearly expanding and worsening abuses in Xinjiang over the last 10 to 15 years is partly why we're seeing what we're seeing now. Nobody said no. Nobody said you can't do that. Nobody said that's unacceptable. Nobody said it's 2018. We don't lock people up, en masse based on their race or religion or ethnicity. And it's problematic enough that there's been relatively little objection, coming from more democratic countries. I think it's particularly problematic that Muslim majority countries have not fought back against that. Certainly, I agree with Carl that perhaps Malaysia, Anwar Ibrahim's remarks in the last couple of weeks have been extraordinary, and I think we're all desperately hoping that might signal a change and that he might be a real leader on behalf of countries like Malaysia, Indonesia, Turkey. These are countries that, like every country, have serious human rights violations, but also, I think, have something to say on these issues. I almost fell off my seat on the metro this morning when reading some comments from a fairly senior Pakistani government official chiding China over the treatment of Uyghurs. That is not something that happens often. Whether that signals a different coalition going forward, but I think if China were to be confronted by Malaysia, Pakistan, Indonesia, Turkey, that world, along with the U.S., Canada, Germany, Japan, the EU, et cetera, it's a message that's perceived very differently in Beijing. And I think shows some sense of solidarity. One other clear dimension is that there's, I think, a real cognitive dissonance. I'm amazed that people who have, obviously in HRW's view, been rightly incredibly critical of the Trump administration for separating children from their families either just don't know or don't believe that China's doing that too, right? There seems to be an unwillingness to apply some of the same criticisms to Xi and the Chinese leadership that come at other governments.
I'd like to add to a couple of points. One, when you look at the timing of this whole nightmare started, it coincides with the United States and Western governments backsliding from democratic principles. Sophie is absolutely right. No one is calling them out publicly. And two, the slow response also has something to do with the lack of understanding and knowledge about the Uyghur struggle overall in the public arena. In 2009, there was enormous media interest. And then before that, when the Guantanamo Uyghurs story being told in the media, there was some interest. And then it disappeared, evaporated. And now it came back again. So it's back and forth interest. There's no coherent policy being formulated, implemented by liberal governments. And then the second thing is, I think it's very important to note that some Western governments, including our own, somewhat believes or somewhat give an impression to the Chinese that the West is fighting a similar type of war as the Chinese when it comes to extremism or national security. That may have been given a pause to some government officials to take an action. Even the new EU ambassador to China asking for evidence. What evidence do you really want at this point? That is a ludicrous statement made by a representative EU to the People's Republic of China. That's the reality that we are dealing with today.
Can I ask you guys a question from the Chinese dissident community or other interlocutors from the Chinese the sort of the Han Chinese population? What has been the response to these reports? How have they received them? Are there allies out there?
I'd like to point out. I'd like to address this in two different ways. One, within China, not much, but outside of China, especially within the Chinese dissident communities in the United States, I've seen some sympathy, public statements of support. People like Teng Biao have been speaking out. So we'd like to see more. And sadly, I mean, people always ask, what is next? What is going to happen? Without the Chinese people standing up to their government, Xi Jinping's government, I don't think that we will see much change within China. What is happening today in East Turkestan is a lab testing. They're using the Uyghurs and the Uyghurs' homeland as a laboratory for their pilot program. This whole thing is going to be expanded to over other parts of China. I alert and I warn the Chinese citizens living on the other part of China to take this issue very seriously. This is not about Uyghurs. This is not about Kazakhs. This is about you. So that's the message that I'd like to send to the people living outside of East Turkestan.
Great. Let's go 2 questions in the back.
Thanks. Michael Allen with the NED. I was interested in Nury's comments about, I think you called it race-based nationalism, that was the kind of ideological driving force behind the repression in the region. And it reminded me of a book called Why Communism Did Not Collapse, which looked at China, Cuba, Vietnam, etc., and concluded by and large that all of these regimes survived to a large extent because they had rejected traditional Marxism, traditional Marxist ideology, and had become extremely nationalist, developed a nationalist narrative. So I wondered if you could elaborate on your comments. Do you think that this race-based nationalism is really about shoring up the regime's domestic legitimacy as well as the international dimension that you addressed in your comments?
Well, let's take the 2 questions because we're running out of time. So right next, there you go.
So I'm a Chinese student for Georgetown University. So I have never heard about this re-education camps before I came to United States. So as you know, so as more and more Chinese students will go to United States to study about some new informations, I would like to say there are more and more student campaign in China, but the government's repressive action is become more and more tense. So like you mentioned about the external section on Chinese government, so do you think it will be effective to influence like ordinary Chinese people's thinking patterns about like ethnicity or nation states? Okay, that's it.
Mike, thank you for that question. So this racism aspect of the ongoing nightmare has not been widely discussed. The historians have put it out. Early this week, Brent Stephen of New York Times discussed this, and Robert Kaplan also mentioned this. But one thing that the Chinese people have not come to a realization is that this Han Chinese language, the culture, the preference and the way of life is not something universal. And why would you force somebody to accept that is so foreign to you? So when you look at this, calling Uyghur identity is some sort of virus that they need to use chemical to weed out, and the spirituality is a mental disease, I think it reminds us a casebook example of racism. So there's no other way to look at it other than Chinese global ambition, wiping out the entire population by force. One of the American influential intellectuals recently used the term final solution. That should have a chilling effect in our thoughts. So what is that final solutions for? They try this and try that, implement bilingual education, send the Uyghur kids to inland high schools to change their minds, forcing Uyghur ladies to marry Han Chinese people, and making Uyghur kids to spy on their parents if they have any separatist ideologies being discussed on a dining table. So they tried everything. This is the final solution for the Chinese government. The final solution is based on that racist ideologies.
Are there the 2 questions?
Yes, I just add a little to what Nury said. So, As the Wall Street Journal, the article says, China subjugated. For example, there's some mistake in the article as well, because Qing dynasty was not a Chinese dynasty. You know, Manching, the Manchurians didn't invade China, build a country for Chinese people. They built the empire for themselves. So first Chinese country was Kuomintang. We should start from there. So the Manchurians, when they invaded in China, controlled China more than 300 years. They've been melted. They're gone. The Mongols, who controlled China for hundreds of years, they're gone. Let's say the biggest minority group in China, what's it called? The Zhuangzu, they call it, Guangxi Zhuangzu. That's the biggest number of minorities in China. They're gone. That's namely, they're minorities. They don't have any language. They don't have any religious identity. They don't have any ethnic identity or different looks, because we don't see any issues happening there in those places. So, and also that article says Tibet is subjugated. You know what it means. And last, the people should be subjugated is us, Uyghurs, because we have distinct look, distinct culture, distinct language, because our language system, in China, there's 3 different language systems. One is Tibetan Chinese Sino language system. Another one is Turkic Altaic language system. Our language system belongs to the other parts of the world, not into the Chinese Tibetan system. Even the language system, religion, look, culture, everything totally alien to them. They say, I was told in 1997 when Jiang Zemin arrived into Uyghur region and said, oh, this is a foreign country. He was shocked because it's a foreign country since China said, since the ancient times. What ancient times? And this article also said Chinese dynasties existed 3,500 years, but Uyghurs only controlled by Manchurians, not Chinese. Late 17th century, 18th century, 17th century. That's it. So because of that, they're trying to dilute Uyghur identity, erode Uyghur language. Because of those, we protected ourselves because we belong to Altaic peoples, Turkic peoples in Central Asia, from us to all the way to the, what's it called? Anatolia plates. Like Turkey, for example, right? So we don't belong to that culture. Because of that, China sees it as a threat. Because of that, like 20 years ago, China had this policy, shave your mustache. Because that's the policy. Because teachers, if they have mustache, they look like scared. They don't look, just don't feel comfortable. Because it's a homogeneous country. Because they don't want any people who are different in that country. Because of that, they're doing those policies just signify, just melt every people. That's why the religion is being taken away. The language is banned in school. After 9/11, Uyghur language is banned in universities. But 2 years ago, it's banned totally. So no Uyghur schools are left to teach in schools right now. Uyghur textbooks are confiscated. This is what we reported, actually. This is also Chinese media reported. If you speak Uyghur language at this moment, it's a crime. It's a crime because we have the tips. We have also credible reports. You cannot use your language anywhere. So imagine this is happening at this moment. Because of those identity, because of those threat China is feeling, they're doing this against Uyghurs. Because we happen to be the luckiest people who can protect themselves from different policies and as a whole. And right now, they're taking away the language. Family units is being destroyed. Kids are being brainwashed as young as 3 in the government schools, totally government-controlled schools. So parents has nothing to say. What they're being taught, what they're being fed. Even at home, they cannot teach them their family values. So if the family unit is destructed whole society will collapse. So China is creating artificial state, what do you call it, like, I forgot this, all of a sudden I'm eating my tongue. State welfare system. So Uyghurs are artificially forced to be poor. So we pay you, don't even have to work. Right now, they're losing their benefits, crops, everything. Right? If you're poor, and this whole population would be forced into ghettos. The people who live in poverty has nothing to say, nothing to do in the society. Period. That's what they do. So family is taken away, language, religion, kids, and your wealth is being taken away. Your dignity is being taken away. So the whole society on the verge of collapse. This is perilous moment that we're living at this moment.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we're out of time. I wanted to thank the three panelists and to echo what everyone has said about RFA and the journalists who have taken great personal risk to bring these stories. It's clearly beginning to get attention, and I think the work of UHRP, Human Rights Watch, RFA, the NED, all of these organizations are really critical to continuing to raise this story. Thank you all for coming this morning.
Thank you, Brian.